The flight attendant in front came out of the cockpit, and she gathered us in the galley, and her hand was on my shoulder and it was shaking, and she said, "Two planes have crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. The president's declared a national state of emergency and we're landing soon."
You're listening to The Wisdom Project, a podcast produced by the Louie Nunn Center for Oral History in the University of Kentucky Libraries. My name is Doug Boyd. Specifically, you're listening to the launch of Season 3 of The Wisdom Project. If you've listened before, you'll know we've been on an extended hiatus, but we've got plenty of really great episodes lined up for this season, so stay tuned. In planning out the episodes for this season, I felt it was just right to launch with this episode. I don't know about you, but I don't recall much, if anything, about September 10th, 2001. But I have vivid and emotional memories of September 11th. With this being the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the crash of Flight 93, I've been thinking a great deal about what the Nunn Center has in the way of oral history interviews that relate. There are literally dozens of 9/11 oral history projects out there, massive projects, many of which are centered around New York City. My dear friend Mary Marshall Clark at the Columbia Center for Oral History Research has written a beautiful book from one of those oral history projects. Although the Nunn Center does not have an entire project dedicated to 9/11, we have some really powerful moments captured in interviews that were conducted in the days and the weeks following. So I started going through a lot of the interviews and listening to a lot of those moments. But I kept coming back to one interview. An interview that I conducted on September 11th, 2002, exactly 1 year to the day after the attacks. I had the incredible opportunity to conduct an oral history interview with a young woman named Janet Foushee. Janet Foushee grew up on a farm in Meade County, Kentucky. The reason I was interviewing Janet that day was because Janet was a flight attendant who was working on September 11th. In fact, she was serving breakfast to passengers at 35,000 feet when she and the rest of the crew were told of the attacks. For this episode, we're going to take a moment to just listen to Janet Foushee recall those moments. I remember this interview like it was yesterday. In fact, it was totally spontaneous. We found a relatively quiet room. I remember sitting across from Janet at the table, turning on the recorder. I asked Janet my first question. Why don't you walk me through that day?
Well, the day's events began when the captain called. We were on the flight from Albuquerque to Atlanta, and about halfway through, after our meal service had been served, our breakfast, the captain called back on the phone. We all picked up, and he said, "Can you come to the cockpit, please?" And she said yes, and we all hung up, which was unusual because usually they're more casual, ask for coffee or what have you. And this was just a request to come up to the cockpit. And so I hung up the phone in the back and told the other flight attendant what he said and just kind of raised my eyebrows, wondering what it could mean. And a few minutes later, I was in the first class galley, and the flight attendant in front came out of the cockpit, and she gathered us in the galley, and her hand was on my shoulder and it was shaking, and she said, "Two planes have crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. The president's declared a national state of emergency and we're landing soon, as soon as possible. We're not sure yet where we're going to land. He's going to let us know, but the captain wants everything picked up. He's going to make an announcement to the passengers in a few minutes." So I went back to the back of the airplane to the back galley and told the flight attendant back there what I had been told, and I went out to the aisle to pick up breakfast and was trying to organize my thoughts and to tell people why I was picking up their breakfast when we were only halfway to Atlanta, and I had just served them the breakfast. So I basically just said that we're going to be landing soon. The captain's going to make an announcement explaining why. The plane is fine, but he wants everything to be picked up for landing. And nobody asked too many questions, since I had said that the captain was going to make a PA, an announcement, and they were a little confused, but the plane sounded fine, it felt fine, so I don't think they were in fear for their life or anything. They didn't have any concerns that it was the plane. Maybe thought it was a medical emergency on board or something. And after we had all our breakfast picked up, and we were hurrying, and because of the activity, I remained composed. It was still all a blur what was happening. But the captain eventually came on and said, as you've noticed, I've had the flight attendants pick up all the meal service. We're going to be landing shortly in Oklahoma City. The president has declared a national state of emergency and has directed all airplanes across the country to land. We'll be landing shortly. Just do as the flight attendants say, and everything will be fine. And we concluded preparing the cabin for landing and landed in Oklahoma City without incident. And as we got to the gate, we had to ask the passengers to please take all of their belongings with them, as our airplane would be taxied out from the gate to allow other airplanes that were landing at the same time to disembark their passengers at the same jetway. And passengers were a little confused because they wanted to get to Atlanta. They had connections to make. They had a day's agenda planned. Taking their bags off was a little bit more serious than just hopping off or getting refueled or whatever. So, but they did get off without any delay. And of course, we were the last to get off, and discussing, since we knew more than the passengers did at the moment, discussing what was going to happen, what our plan was going to be. And as we got off, the gate agent announced to us, the crew, that the Pentagon had also been hit by another airplane while we were still in flight. And it was chilling to know that airplanes had hit American targets, and it was still so confusing. And when we got off out into the gate area, that's where the passengers were viewing the TV monitors and were seeing the Twin Towers in New York burning. We gathered our crew and went down to operations downstairs, where other crews were also assembling as they got off their airplanes. And it was there on the TV monitor in the operations that I saw the footage of one of the airplanes actually crashing into the tower. And it's a moment I'll never forget, seeing a passenger airplane crashing into the side of a well-recognized building that I had been in at one point in my life. And it was just so unnerving and still so confusing. We were going to be going to hotels, we were told, and to catch the hotel shuttle. Of course, at this point, I imagine all the airports across the country were doing the same, and any traffic to the airport terminals had been blocked off. And so to get us, as well as passengers, out of the airport, they had arranged shuttle buses to come to the parking area near the airport and to shuttle us off to a parking lot farther away. We happened to get on a bus that was strictly crew members, probably 15 to 20 of us, and as we were getting our bags on and sitting down, the driver was driving us off from the airport. Other flight members were on the cell phones to husbands and family members, and we're talking on the phone, telling them where we were and that we were on the ground. And one person mentioned aloud to all of us, a flight's just crashed in Pennsylvania. And then another person in the van also said the same thing from their conversation with their loved one. And I remember sitting there thinking, when is it going to end? Of course, later we found that was the last plane to crash, but at the time, it was very uncertain. Planes were still landing in Oklahoma City at the airport. There were still planes in the air, I believe, I think 50 planes were still unaccounted for, according to cell phone reports.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking that I was safe here on the ground in a bus, and there were other crew members up in the air still, and passengers, and I wondered how many of them are under duress right now, while I sit here safe and sound. And I also thought, this morning when we all got up and got ready in our hotel rooms and in our homes, and we went to the airport and got on the plane, it was the same old scenario that we've been through many times. And we did it so easily, without any thought, and our lives had changed all of a sudden. And then I thought, as I was picking up breakfast, it had occurred to me as I sat in the van, it occurred to me that while I had been picking up breakfast, putting them back into the galley, stowing trays, preparing to land in Oklahoma City, there was another flight, the flight that crashed in Pennsylvania, where those crew and passengers were under duress. At that moment that I had so calmly and easily put the trays away without any terrorists on my flight, at the same moment there were other passengers and crew struggling for their lives.
Janet and the rest of her crew were grounded in Oklahoma City for 3 days. When looking at the interview, I realized I did not ask many questions, but at some point, I had the realization that Janet, a flight attendant, was going to have to get back on the plane in order to fly home.
I wasn't thrilled at the thought of getting back on an airplane. There were still reports at the time of finding people. I think when we left the airport or the hotel like 8 p.m. on Thursday evening, I believe. And we were scheduled to fly to Salt Lake City, which was not our original flight, but we were so stranded and so scattered that the operations just assigned us a flight to Salt Lake City, and then we were going to fly the all-nighter from Salt Lake City to Cincinnati, getting in at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. And Thursday, late afternoon, I believe, they reported on the news finding a few people with false airline badges at Kennedy, and closed the airport again. I think it had been open for a few hours and they closed it again. So my thought when we were picking up at the hotel was, yes, I want to get out of here. I've been here 3 days. I'm ready to get home. If it means getting on an airplane and flying to Salt Lake City first, that has to be done. I didn't question getting on an airplane. But with the report of Kennedy closing and airline badges being discovered on people in places where they shouldn't have been, it heightened my awareness that though security was at an all-time high, we still needed to be very alert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we went to the airport, and it was a ghost town, literally. Security was, of course, at unprecedented levels. Everybody was very somber. The airport was very quiet. There weren't that many passengers, but still there were probably, I think, between 40 and 50 passengers on our flight, people stranded trying to get home. And it was all very quiet.
Mm.
People just sat in their seats in the gate area, and everything was quiet. We did security searches on our plane, of course, and it had been searched by other people as well. And on those 2 flights home, we were all very alert about looking at passengers in the eye, making sure that nothing seemed out of the ordinary, because there were reports that there could be terrorists still waiting, stranded like everybody else, waiting to get back on an airplane and continue their mission. So we were very alert. And of course I was on a 727, which is not the 767s that were used and the 757s that were used in the crashes. And we were out in Oklahoma City going to Salt Lake City, so I didn't feel like we were going into any dangerous territory. But of course we were all alert, because we didn't know where the terrorists had been stranded and where they were trying to get to. And the all-night flight from Salt Lake City to Cincinnati was unnerving in that we were emotionally exhausted, but physically exhausted as well. We hadn't slept well in several days, and this was an all-nighter flight, getting in at 6 a.m. in the morning, and it was dark. The cabin was dark, people were sleeping or trying to sleep, and I wanted to be on a flight where there was daylight. I wanted to be able to see.
Yes.
And so our nerves were fraught, and we were tired, and it was dark. It was not a flight I enjoyed. And I remember on that flight, as well as some flights following, being very sensitive to particularly men approaching me in a galley, cornering me in a galley, blocking my exit from the back of the airplane. And people just were unaware of what my reaction would be, and so didn't think twice about coming into the galley, blocking my exit. Particularly, a man came in this is what brought this reaction. I mean, this was what made me aware of my feeling when a man approached me, literally put his face near my face. And he was a large man, and I didn't know why he wanted to do that, to speak to me. Couldn't he speak to me from 2 feet away? There's a variety of people out in the world, and they all don't have the same mentality. He, of course, just wanted to ask a question, but the movement to me, close to me, disturbed me, and from then on I was very cautious of where I stood in the galley, keeping an eye out all the time. And this continued for a couple months, my awareness of where I was and where passengers were, physically. I was not afraid to fly, perhaps because in the months following, perhaps because I was out there flying when it occurred, when the events happened. And I wasn't at home hearing tidbits on the TV or hearsay from the neighbors next door. I was in the midst of it when it happened, on a plane, and so to get back on a plane was not difficult for me. I got in at 6 a.m. on the following Friday morning, exhausted, slept, and then the next morning on a 7 a.m. flight was scheduled to fly to LaGuardia. And I remember distinctly the evening before not wanting to go to LaGuardia. They just opened the airports back up on Friday at noon, and I was scheduled to fly up there Saturday a.m. And I thought, why are they opening New York? We flew up there without incident, of course, on an MD-88. Again, not a big airplane. And when we were supposed to fly a completely full flight, which is about 150 people. And we ended up leaving with only 35. I don't know if it was due to people afraid to fly or people couldn't get through security. At this point, security was just overwhelmed, and people were missing their flights because they didn't allow enough time. The lines were very long in front of security, and so I don't know if that caused some of our passengers not to make the flight, or if there was probably a bit of both. But 35 people went to LaGuardia with us. Again, I worked in coach, and people were curious throughout the flight what direction would we be landing. And of course the pilots didn't know at the time until they were given direction from the control tower what approach to make. And when the captain did find out, he announced over the public address system to the passengers that Manhattan would be on the left-hand side. And so silently, as we approached Manhattan, everybody on the plane, including first class passengers, who came in to coach, they all found window seats on the left-hand side. There's about 38 rows on the MD-88, and so everyone had a window seat, even if they had to come back to coach to find one. And as we passed over Manhattan, the captain asked for a moment of silence, which was happening anyway. And you really couldn't see Manhattan, the tip of Manhattan. You couldn't see Ground Zero. There was so much smoke billowing out of the crater that not only did it obscure Ground Zero, but the whole tip of Manhattan seemed to be just a cloud of smoke. And we landed without incident, of course. I flew up there later that month and could see Manhattan at this point. There was still smoke curling up from Ground Zero. It was still burning. And the skyline was so changed. I lived in New York City for a short time when I first was hired. And I had been to Lower Manhattan a few times. I'd been into the World Trade Center. And the skyline was so changed. It is still changed. It just is such a remarkable difference. It's just gone. And that's the events as I remember them.
Sometimes oral histories are conducted many years, decades sometimes, following an event. There's value in this approach. With time comes perspective, context. But this interview really underscores the importance of interviewing while the memories are fresh. It's important that we remember and commemorate 9/11. I was walking around the campus of the University of Kentucky just the other day thinking about this episode. And I had the realization that a large percentage of the students walking around me were too young to have personal memories of that day, or they had not even been born. I want to thank Janet Foushee for agreeing to be spontaneously interviewed that morning of September 11th, 2002. Thank you, Janet, for agreeing to archive your story and share it with history. Although Janet's interview continues to have a temporary access restriction on it, Janet was gracious enough to allow us to use the excerpts for this episode and to honor the 20th anniversary. So you won't be able to listen to Janet's interview online just yet, but you can hear other individual perspectives and memories, oral histories that recall the events of September 11th, 2001, by going to KentuckyOralHistory.org. The Wisdom Project is brought to you by the Louie B. Nunn Center for Oral History. We're part of the Special Collections Research Center in the University of Kentucky Libraries. This episode was produced by me, Doug Boyd. I also wrote and recorded the music. You can connect with us on our website, libraries.uky.edu/Nunn Center, or on our Facebook page. We're on Twitter at Nunn Center, or me personally at Douglas A. Boyd. On Instagram, we're Nunn Center, all one word, and you can check out our blog at nunncenter.org. You can listen to or subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's on all the major platforms. You can also find the podcast on the webpage, thewisdomproject.life. Thank you for taking this moment to listen. Stay tuned for the next episode of The Wisdom Project.